at the end. And then whenever things pick up, the first 8 verses are a wonderful, wonderful example of Hebrews chapter 13, where it talks about, in the context of loving brethren, he says, make sure and show hospitality even to brethren that you don't know very well. It talks about them being strangers. And you realize, he says, because some have done so and have entertained angels without even knowing it. Now, if you notice at this point, how are they described? As men. So, is Abraham aware of who they are?
I'm not sure. I don't think so.
No. Now, here's another aspect. If you think about the hospitality that he offers, I mean, think about this for a second. He offers to, let me wash your feet. He says to Sarah, go and bake some bread. And it just says 3 measures. And if you have a footnote, this will kind of blow your socks off. The idea is for a Sarah, I mean, the term of the measure is a seah, and 1 seah is 11 quarts. 3 measures is what he says. So 33 quarts worth of fine flour. How much bread would that make? A lot, right? Now, a lot. So Abraham tells her, hurry up, go do this. And they go, hurry up. I mean, here's in the end, it's 132 cups worth of fine flour. How many of you have ever made a recipe that had 132 cups of fine flour? 5 is rough enough, right? Then, as it continues on in verse 7, Abraham runs out to the herd. He finds a tender and choice calf. We would probably say a fattened calf. He says, give it to the servant, and he hurried to prepare it. And you go, how many people would even a calf feed? A lot of people. And then from there, Abram goes on, and he takes curds and milk. Curds, kind of like cheese. Milk, of course, we know what that is. And to go, really what's going on here is, this is hospitality at its height. Of going, you come here and do this. And then comes in this question in verse 9. He says, then they said to him, of course, the men, we're going to call them that at this point. He says, say to Abraham, where is Sarah, your wife? And he said, there in the tent. I wonder what she was doing in the tent. My goodness. I mean, 132 cups worth of, 36 pounds worth of fine flour. And to go, here she is. Then, of course, you get these details in verse 10. He says, I will surely return to you at this time next year, and behold, Sarah, your wife, will have a son. And Sarah was listening at the door, which was behind him. And to go, I'm going to return to you again at this time next year, and that time's coming. It's over in Genesis 21, verse 12. He says, and Sarah, and notice the very specific aspect, Sarah, your wife, shall have a son. Notice, it doesn't just say, and Sarah will have a son, because according to the past with Hagar, what might they start thinking? Well, it's going to be some woman named Sarah, but who's it going to be? Clears all that up very easily. Sarah, your wife, will have a son. Of course, Sarah's listening, and in verse 11, Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age. Do you ever want your introduction to be that way? Old, advanced in age, and it tells you that for a reason. Sarah was past childbearing. I mean, those years are far gone by. Sometimes we look at the ages. Abraham's going to live to be 175 years old. Sometimes we wonder, looking at those ages, well, I wonder if things were really different for them in terms of progression and maturity and the time for having children being different. And you realize, here is Sarah at the age of 89, and it's talking about her as, look, those days are past, typically. Then, of course, verse 13, it continues on. And, well, let's deal with 12 first. Sarah laughed to herself. Notice, not necessarily out loud, but to herself. saying, after I have become old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also? Who's she referring to as her Lord? Abraham. Which tells you, and once again, she's saying this within her own heart. So this is telling you about her attitude toward Abraham. Now, make a little footnote. I'll read it to you. But 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 4 through 6, uses this as an example of the attitude of godly women. Because listen to these verses. 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 4 through 6 says, but let it be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable quality of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is precious in the sight of God. Here's the tie here to Sarah. For in this way, in former times, the holy women also who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, being submissive to their own husbands. What was her attitude of submission? God's saying, we're going to have a son. He says, even while being old, my Lord, my husband, being old too? And to go, wow, that's her attitude within her heart. She shouldn't just say, oh, my old husband's going to do this. She says, my Lord, He's the one that I'm going to serve. And you realize there's holiness at the heart of it. And this tells you about her attitude. Now, also here as it continues in 1 Peter, it says, being submissive to their own husbands, just as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you have become her children if you do what is right without being frightened by any fear. Now, you realize this attitude that she has, even though it's a laughter within herself about how in the world would this happen? I mean, I'm 89 years old, my husband's 99 years old, and yet the hidden attitude of the heart is about, I'm going to be submissive. And that tells you about what's precious in the eyes of God. Now, back in Genesis chapter 18, you come to verse 13, and the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh, saying, shall I indeed bear a son when I am so old? And then it's almost as if you could underline this next question in verse 14 and realize that it's the Lord who's saying it. And notice in verse 13, Lord's in all caps. This is the covenant God. And this is kind of the picture of El Shaddai. Do you remember talking about El Shaddai in previous chapters? Overall, powerful. He says in verse 14, is anything too difficult for the Lord, the covenant God? Is that really the way we see God? Of going, is any situation too difficult for the covenant God that we serve? We know intellectually what the right answer should be if we have faith. But do we let that really penetrate the heart? To go, no matter how difficult life is, do we go, I don't know how in the world this could ever get better? And to go, is God going to be faithful to His promises? Is He dependent upon man's situations as to whether He can be faithful or not? Certainly not. So the question gets posed here by the Lord, is anything too difficult for the Lord? And then notice the next statement. At the appointed time I will return to you at this time next year, and Sarah will have a son. And you have to think in those terms of going, wow, it's going to be quite a year. Then, verse 15 says, Sarah denied it, however, saying, I did not laugh, for she was afraid. And he said, no, but you did laugh. He says, here's the truth. You laughed on the inside. Now, you may not have laughed outside, but you laughed on the inside. Then, verse 16 begins with this. Then the men rose up from there. Notice it still refers to them as men. 3 of them, they came. It says, then the men rose up from there and looked down towards Sodom. And Abraham was walking with them to send them off. Let me just give you a general idea of the topography of the land. The Oaks of Mamre, where Abraham lived, is around the city of Hebron. Hebron is on the very top of the mountains that are there in Judea. Not quite as high as Jerusalem, but still on the mountaintops. Roughly a little bit more than a mile high. It's more than 5,000 feet high in elevation. whenever he looks down to Sodom, Sodom is actually either at sea level or perhaps even a little bit below sea level. So here he is at this high vantage point looking down, and Hebron is 30 miles away from where Sodom and Gomorrah would have been. Now, just so you know, so you don't think that this is something miraculous that he can see that far. Even on a clear day, if you're at a height of about 5,000 feet in elevation, you can see like 97 miles. If you ever get that vantage point, you can see a long ways. And to go, here he is looking down and seeing Sodom and Gomorrah, and there's two other cities that are mentioned by name that are also going to be destroyed, but you don't learn about those unless you're in Deuteronomy. And so he's looking down and seeing them. Does he have any connection with Sodom? What are those connections? His nephew Lot lives there. You know that one, number one. If you remember some 25 years before this, he even had an ally, Bera, the king of Sodom, who whenever they went out to fight against the other kings in chapter 14, he says, I had some people who were allies who helped me go down and fight against Chedorlaomer and to destroy them. And God was faithful to us because we were faithful. I walked faithfully with him. He said he would bless those that I bless and curse those who cursed me. He says, and we went down there and you go, that's where the allies were. How much has changed in Sodom and Gomorrah now? Has it gotten better or worse? The word is, we would say the word on the street is, it's gotten worse. Now, we'll come back to that in a moment. So realize, here he is looking down here going, I have family there. I have men who may not even still be alive anymore and these allies. But looking down and seeing that. So, here it is as it continues. He says, and Abraham was walking with them to send them off. So, here he is, and I venture to say you might do this too, and you have company that come in and they're getting ready to leave and you're really fond of them, and you might walk them out to the car, right? You might get out there to the sidewalk or to the pavement, or you might even go out to the road and wave to them as they leave. But you kind of notice through this of going, here's what Abraham does. I mean, these guys had to be, there's plenty of food that was prepared, that's for sure. And now they're walking away. Verse 17, once again, here's one of these that is a messenger specifically for the Lord. Because you know they can't be talking to the Lord himself in terms of if you see the Lord's face, what's going to happen to you? You will die. I mean, there's no two ways about it. And you can read that for yourself in Exodus 33, verse 20. But you can't see the face of God and live. So here it is, verse 17. The Lord said, and I want you to realize, Abraham hears this whole conversation, this whole statement, because when we get down to verse 22, Abraham is going to respond to these things. So he actually hears this. This is not something that these three men are just saying among themselves. So, verse 17, the Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? Since Abraham will surely become a great and mighty nation, and in him all the nations of the earth will be blessed. He says, should I hide what I'm about to do? And notice, what's the reasoning that he speaks of as to why he's contemplating this? Look at what he's promised. Yeah. In verse 18, he says, but since Abraham will surely become a great and mighty nation, why is he surely going to become a great and mighty nation? Because God promised him he would. They have a covenant about it. Then, he says, and in him all the nations of the earth will be blessed. He says, every nation is going to be blessed through Abraham. Should I withhold telling him what I'm about to do? Now, this statement actually gets quoted over in the New Testament. Look over at Galatians chapter 3. Galatians chapter 3, and look down at verse 7. Just 3 verses I want to look at. Galatians chapter 3, verse 7. says, therefore be sure that it is those who are of faith who are sons of Abraham. So what does the relationship have to be with God in order to be tied to Abraham as a son? A faith response. Not just one who says, I believe, but one who actually responds to the commandments and the ways of God, to imitate them and to obey them. Verse 8, the Scripture foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, because Abraham comes in long before there are Jews and Gentiles, right? There's not that dividing line yet. He says, the Scripture foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, preached the gospel beforehand to Abraham. Preached the gospel. The good news to Abraham. And notice specifically what it quotes here. All the nations will be blessed in you. So when the Lord was making that statement to Abraham back in Genesis chapter 18, when he was talking about that there's going to be a blessing that was going to come through Abraham, who was he really talking about? Jesus. Now, he doesn't reveal that to Abraham, but he tells him about the good news. He says, here's the way it's going to happen. Then verse 9, he says, so then those who are of faith are blessed with Abraham, comma, the believer. Don't you see Abraham responding to God whenever he makes these statements? To think in these terms of going, here's Abraham the believer. Now we can see times where Abraham fails. Remember whenever he was deceptive to the king of Egypt with his wife being, oh, this is my sister. And you realize, oh, there's still some failures there. There's some growing that needed to take place. Do we have those moments too? We have a faith and a belief in who God is and what He desires, and yet we fail, and God doesn't say, oh, I'm done with you, forget it. Instead, He says, look, you turn to me, I'll forgive, and we'll move forward, and you can grow from this. Now, here once again, you see, so then those who are of faith are blessed with Abraham, the believer. He says, and this is why this blessing, he says, all the nations will be blessed in you. Just the Jews?
No.
Who does that include? Us, the Gentiles, right? Now, come back to Genesis chapter 18. So whenever this statement gets made by the Lord, the covenant God, he says, shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do, since Abraham will surely become a great and mighty nation, and in him all the nations of the earth will be blessed? Because the message of Jesus is going to be available to everyone, every tribe, tongue, people, nation, origin, background. Then, verse 19, he says, for I have chosen him, so that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice. What was going to be Abraham's point in living by faith? How do you need to live? Righteousness and justice. You'll find how much do you long to have that be the standard. That righteousness and justice would be the standard. Now, specifically here in verse 19, he says, so that the Lord may bring upon Abraham what he has spoken about him. He says, it's got to be by righteousness and justice. Now, let's go look at a couple of Psalms real quick, and you can really get your hands down in this deep. Look over at Psalm chapter 97. Psalm chapter 97. Look at the first 3 verses. The Lord reigns. Let the earth rejoice. Let the many islands be glad. Notice once again, the covenant God reigns. Let the earth rejoice. It should have an effect on us, knowing that He reigns. He says, let the many islands be glad. What if you're way off in the middle of nowhere on a little old island somewhere? Does it still affect you? It certainly does. Verse 2, clouds and thick darkness surround him. Can you see him real clear? No. Notice the next statement in verse 2. Righteousness and justice are the foundation of his throne. You want to know what everything God does is based on? Righteousness and justice. He will never respond in a way that is outside of righteousness and justice. You can count on that every day of the rest of your life. He will be righteous and he will be just. He never steps away from that. It's the foundation of his throne. And then, just a little foreshadowing, verse 3, fire goes before him and burns up his adversaries round about. What does he have the capabilities of? Can he destroy his adversaries? Does he really reign? When he does, is it about righteousness and justice? Or is it just a flippant move? Always based on righteousness and justice. Look at Psalm 89. Look at verse 14. It's almost verbatim, word for word. Righteousness and justice are the foundation of your throne. Loving kindness and truth go before you. Once again, righteousness and justice. Then the second half of the verse, loving kindness. What's loving kindness about? Covenant love. Is he going to be faithful to his promises? That's what loving kindness is. He says, and truth go before him. It's always going to be in what's true. He'll never step away from that. Skip down in the same chapter to verse 34. He says, my covenant I will not violate, nor will I alter the utterance of my lips. If he has said it, will it change? No. So many times we wonder, well, God said it over here. Does that mean it's going to be different later? If God says it to you once, what do you know? Is it truth? Is he going to keep his promises in loving kindness? Is it going to be just and righteous? Certainly. Notice what covenant he's talking about here, verse 35. Once I have sworn by my holiness, I will not lie to David. Oh, this is a promise to David. He says, and get a load of this one. I have sworn by my holiness. How holy is God? Can't swear by anything greater than himself is the way Hebrews talks about it. And he says, I've sworn by my holiness. He says, if you can doubt my holiness, then you can doubt my promises. But you can't, because I'm faithful. He says, his descendants shall endure forever, and his throne as the sun before me. What promise had God given to David? There will always be a descendant of yours on the throne. Now, notice here, he says, and his throne as the sun before me. And that's S-U-N, by the way. How many days in your life have you seen the effects of the sun? Every single one that you had enough awareness to open your eyes, right? So what do you know about his faithfulness? What do you know about a descendant of David sitting on the throne? Certainly set, right? Now, of course, who do we know is a descendant of David? Jesus. Does he sit on the throne now? He does. Then, he says, and his throne is the sun before me, verse 37, it shall be established forever like the moon. Now, this one's kind of unique. The moon's always there, but do you always see the reflection of it? No. Are there times where it's hard to, you look at situations going on around us and we go, what's going on here? Why is wickedness allowed to continue? And we start to say, is the Lord still reigning? Is the moon still there in the heavens? Is the Son still there? Certainly. What do you know about His promises? He says, I have sworn by my holiness that my Son Jesus is going to sit on the throne. He says, now if you can move the sun and the moon out of its place, He says, then you can discredit my promises. Well, guess what? Man's landed on the moon. Did it change anything? Nope. Didn't move it off its course. Didn't change what it was doing. He says, and the witness in the sky is faithful. He says, you can pay attention to this. So, you notice when it talks about in Jesus' kingdom, you think about His throne, what does He always operate off of? Righteousness and justice. Now, come back to Genesis chapter 18. So, when we look down here in verse 19, he says, for I have chosen him so that he may command his children, his household after him, to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice. And this is how King Jesus operates in the kingdom. He says, so that the Lord may bring upon Abraham what he has spoken about him. Are all the nations going to be blessed in Abraham? Specifically because of his descendant, David, who had a promise also about a descendant named Jesus to sit on the throne. Then, verse 20, and the Lord said, the outcry of Sodom and Gomorrah is indeed great, and their sin is exceedingly grave. How bad is the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah? It is really, really bad. Now, I want you to take special note here of the language that it uses. He says, the outcry of Sodom and Gomorrah is indeed great, but it's not great for the right reason. It's great in terms of their sin is exceedingly grave. And you think, what does that mean to be exceedingly grave? Well, just jot down a note here in terms of Isaiah chapter 3, and I'll read it to you. Isaiah chapter 3, verses 9 through 11. And listen to how far it's gone. You learn about Sodom over in Isaiah chapter 3. Verses 9 through 11. The expression on their faces bears witness against them, and they display their sin like Sodom. They do not even conceal it. Woe to them. How far has it gone? We don't even hide it anymore. This sin is so grave and exceeding that those in Sodom and Gomorrah go, we'll do it, and we'll do it openly. We're not going to do it behind closed doors. We're not even ashamed of it, is the way it sounds. Now, Jeremiah chapter 6 and chapter 8 both talk about a judgment's going to come on Jerusalem. Talks about how evil the people were then. He says they don't even know how to blush. It's gotten so wicked. They do wicked and evil things, but they don't even blush about it anymore. We kind of look at these things and go, I can understand that a little bit. Then as Isaiah 3 continues on, he says, woe to them, for they have brought evil on themselves. Notice who made the choice. They did. Mankind did. Verse 10, say to the righteous that it will go well with them, for they will eat the fruit of their actions. The righteous who are still walking by faith in righteousness and justice, he says, how's it going to go for them? It's going to go well because God is a God of justice. Then, the next verse in Isaiah 3, verse 11, woe to the wicked. It will go badly for them, for what he deserves will be done to him. Is God going to leave the guilty unpunished? No. So you realize, is it worth living faithfully in righteousness and justice? Yeah. No matter how difficult it gets around us, understand, you are going to reap what you sow. Because God is just and He is righteous. Now, come back to looking here at Genesis chapter 18. Look down at verse 20 again. He says, their sin is exceedingly grave. It's so grave they don't even conceal it anymore. It makes you wonder, do they even blush anymore? Then verse 21, I will go down now and see if they have done entirely according to its outcry, which has come to me, and if not, I will know. He says, I'm going to go down there and take a look. And don't think of this in terms of, did God not know? He knows. He says, But this is going to be personal. He says, this is not something I'm just going to do from afar. Karen. It makes you wonder about the people who are there. It could even be from Lot. We'll deal with that hopefully next week. I don't know if we'll have time today, but in going through and realizing somebody's crying out about this wickedness, probably the people who are suffering because of it, would be my guess, but I don't know. He says, would you come to me and I'm going to go down. Verse 22. Then the men turned away from there and went towards Sodom, while Abraham was still standing before the Lord. Remember, starts off with 3. Now 2 are going down towards Sodom and Gomorrah, and 1, the messenger of the Lord, is still there with Abraham. Then, verse 23, Abraham came near and said, will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? He says, is this what you're going to do? Now, does Abraham think he knows how many righteous people there are in Sodom? You're going to find something here in a minute. I know you probably already read it, but looking at it, and his big question is, are you going to destroy the righteous and the wicked? Are you going to treat them the same? Do you see how that sounds odd to Abraham? Like he's kind of having trouble with this thought?
Is it okay to question God?
Well, let's see. Let's find out. Look at how it continues. Verse 24. Suppose there are 50 righteous within the city. Will you indeed sweep it away and not spare the place for the sake of the 50 righteous who are in it? He says, just suppose. Now, does the Lord God already know how many righteous there are in Sodom? By the time this story is all told, we'll find out that there might just be 1. By the time we get everything gathered together next week, we'll probably see that. But here's Abraham saying, what if there are 50? Would you spare the righteous for the sake of 50? Would you spare Sodom? Isn't this kind of the same things we wonder about when we hear about disasters that take place and we go, would God allow this to happen to the righteous? Would he do this? Then, verse 25, he says, notice what Abraham recognizes about God. Far be it from you to do such a thing, to slay the righteous with the wicked, so that the righteous and the wicked are treated alike. Does Abraham know God enough to realize this is not what you would do? He's like, what I know about you and what I see about to happen don't seem to match up in my head. We ever have that same kind of struggle? We know who God is, at least we think we do. And then we see some outcome that happens and we go, I don't see how these two go hand in hand. And so Abraham makes this statement, far be it from you to do such a thing, to slay the righteous and the wicked, to treat them the same. He says, far be it from you, shall not the judge of all the earth deal justly? Are you not going to deal in righteousness and justice? Isn't it amazing how well Abraham knows the Lord? Now, he says, he even recognizes him as being the judge of all the earth. Verse 26. So the Lord said, if I find in Sodom 50 righteous in the city, then I will spare the whole place on their account. Now, doesn't that sound like, all right, if your statement is if there's 50, not do it, sure, if there's 50, I won't do it. You think about how far away we are from the actual number. And there's a part of me that just wonders if the answer was just too quick. Kind of like the same way of, maybe sometimes when children make deals with their parents, if I can do this, can I have that? Sure, go right ahead. If you can lift 40 tons with your bare hands, yeah, I'll buy you a new car, sure. But you notice as this continues on, what seems like, oh, please, would you spare Lot? Would you spare any others that he might be thinking of? Verse 27, and Abraham replied, now behold, I have ventured to speak to the Lord. although I am but dust and ashes. What did Abraham realize about himself? I'm nothing compared to you. Just dust and ashes. I mean, Solomon talks about from dust to dust, from ash to ash. You know, you think about those terms. You go, you know what? If you died in a fire and your body was all burned, does it really matter? No. Now, God can resurrect us from anything. Now, verse 28. Suppose the 50 righteous are lacking 5. Will you destroy the whole city because of 5? And he said, I'll not destroy it if I find 45 there. It's like reverse auction going on here. It's like 50? Sure, 50. You bet. I won't destroy it on account if there are 50 righteous. He says, I know I'm just but dust and ashes. What if we lack just 5 in getting to that 50 number? 45? I won't destroy it for 45. Verse 29. He spoke to him yet again and says, suppose 40 are found there. And he said, I will not do it on account of the 40. Then he said, oh, may the Lord not be angry. I mean, you know those times where, you know, oh, I probably shouldn't ask again, but, would you? And he says, may the Lord not be angry, the covenant God not be angry. He says, I shall speak. Suppose 30 are found there. He says, I will not do it if I find 30 there. He says, and he said, now behold, I have ventured to speak to the Lord. Suppose 20 are found there. And he said, I will not destroy it on account of the 20. It's almost like this is going too fast. He is too quick to give in. We're not even getting close to the real number. I wonder what was going through Abraham's head at this point. But notice verse 32. He says, then he said, oh, may the Lord not be angry, and I shall speak only this once. He says, just one more time, let me appeal. Just one more. Don't be angry with me. He says, suppose 10 are found there. What if there's just 10? And he said, I will not destroy it on account of the 10. And if you notice at this point, in verse 33, it says, as soon as he had finished speaking to Abraham, as soon as the Lord had finished speaking to Abraham, the Lord departed and Abraham returned to his place. He says, now this has worked its way down, 10. Now, I don't know how much really Abraham knows about Lot and his family and those kind of things at this point, in terms of whether he even knows about the 2 daughters, those kind of things that we know are coming in chapter 19. But I want you to realize here of going, God was going to be just and righteous no matter what. And I want to show you another one real quickly. Look over at Jeremiah. Jeremiah chapter 5. Just want to catch these first 3 verses, and I want to show you something. This is the judgment that was going to be coming upon Jerusalem. Jeremiah chapter 5, look at verse 1. Roam to and fro through the streets of Jerusalem, and look now and take note. Now he's talking to Jeremiah, the Lord is. He says, and look now and take note, and seek in her open squares if you can find a man. If there is one who does justice, who seeks truth, then I will pardon her. He says, if in Jerusalem, Jeremiah, you just go through all the streets, you talk to everybody you can find, and if you can find one person who does justice and seeks truth, I won't destroy Jerusalem. And guess what the fate of Jerusalem was? It was utterly destroyed. Which tells you, was God righteous in how he dealt with Jerusalem? Because if there would have been one who seeked after justice and the truth, God says, I would spare it. And does God keep his word? So whenever you see destruction come through, and you ever wonder, how could God do this? How could he allow this to happen? What should we focus on? What do you know about the Lord God? He is righteous and just. and understand He keeps His promises generation to generation. And if you ever doubt it, look up at the sun and catch the moon, because they're still there. And you know who sits on the throne, and it's Jesus. And His throne is established and founded on righteousness and justice. Now, I would say let's read the next 2 verses, but we won't. All right. Lord willing, we'll come back next week, and we'll get on into Genesis chapter 19.